May the angels bless you with pure light and endless love today. Welcome to the channel Angel's Message for You. Have you ever found yourself going about your normal daily life, maybe just driving down the road, washing the dishes, or sitting on your couch, when suddenly a huge wave of emotion washes over you? Have you ever felt an unexplainable tightness in your chest, a sudden urge to cry, or a deep, powerful longing for someone, and you just could not figure out why it was happening out of nowhere? If this sounds familiar, you are in exactly the right place today. What if I told you that in those exact moments, across the miles, the person you are deeply connected to was having a profound, spiritually guided dream about you? This is not just a random coincidence. Heaven is actively working behind the scenes to align your paths right now. You will want to stay with me and watch this video until the very end, because your guardian angel is about to reveal exactly what your soulmate saw in this sacred dream. We are going to talk about what the universe is guiding them to do next, and how your life is about to change in the most beautiful and loving way imaginable. Dear one, last night the person you love fell asleep just like any other night, but this time their soul was gently guided to a very special place. They were led to a quiet, peaceful space between the waking world and the spiritual world. This is a place where only true feelings can reach. It is a sacred space where no lies can survive, where walls fall down, and where everything pure and real is revealed without any fear. And it was there, in that beautiful, invisible space, that you appeared to them. Have you ever had a dream that felt more real than your actual waking life? Dream where your heart just knows that what it saw was a deep truth being shown to you before the time was right to see it in the physical world. That is exactly what happened to your soulmate last night. This person dreamed about you again, but this time something truly sacred and divine was in the room with them. A gentle, clear, and loving spiritual presence was there, guiding the heart of this person who misses you so much. This divine presence was showing them exactly which path they need to take from now on to finally be together with you and to live out this amazing love story. In this beautiful dream, it was not just a bunch of scattered, confusing images or random words. There was a clear direction. There was a pure purpose. It was as if a soft whisper from heaven was speaking directly into their ear, telling them to look closely, to feel deeply, and to understand with their entire soul. And with every single step they took in that dream, your presence acted just like a compass pointing them true north. You were not just a still picture or a faded memory from the past. You were something alive, glowing with meaning and filling up their heart. The most surprising and wonderful part is that in this dream, you were not just seen with their eyes. You were felt with their entire spirit. First, they saw your warm, comforting smile. Then they heard your voice speaking directly to them. You looked right at them and said that you love them more than anything in this world. You told them that even though you have both been through so many difficult obstacles, you never gave up on them. You said you were so thankful to finally be living this love together. Those words completely disarmed your soulmate's heart. All the heavy armor they have been wearing just melted away. In that exact moment, something broke open inside of this person. Maybe it was an old fear that had been holding them back. Maybe it was an old doubt that kept them stuck in the past. Whatever it was completely replaced with a strong certainty that is still echoing inside of them right now. They know now that this love is completely real and it is begging to finally happen in the real world. But there is something more you need to hear, and you need to listen with a very open heart. In this dream, a spiritual message was given to them. It was as if someone from above was holding their hand, showing them what steps need to be taken next. They were shown what choices must be made and what answers only the heart can give when the mind is finally quiet. And I, as your guardian angel, am here today to tell you that this message cannot just stay a dream. It was sent to you too. Heaven is working hard to bring both sides of this connection together. It is time for you to understand everything that was shown to this person during this magical, divinely guided night. Right now, in this very moment, choices are being formed in their mind. Feelings are waking up inside of them in a way that can never go back to sleep. If you are hearing this message today, it is absolutely not by chance. A much bigger purpose is unfolding right in front of your eyes. You need to understand exactly what is happening with this person and what it means for your future together. While you were sleeping peacefully, something huge was happening on the other side of your connection. Your physical body might not have noticed it, but your soul was fully aware. A signal from above reached not only you but also the person who carries your name secretly in their heart. In the middle of the quiet night, their spirit was touched by an invisible force of love. Nothing about this was an accident. They were taken to a place where emotions speak so much louder than any spoken words. And there you were, completely present. Your eyes, your energy, your warmth, everything that time, physical distance, or silly human fears have never been able to erase. It was in that secret, safe place where only true love can enter that your soulmate found you once again. But they did not find you as a memory. They found you as a spiritual reality. The connection was so bright and so real that even after they woke up and opened their eyes, their heart could not go back to the way it was the day before. The dream made a massive impact, and that impact is changing them from the inside out. The scene they saw was as clear as crystal. You were smiling with a rare, beautiful tenderness. Your love felt as if they were being wrapped up in a warm blanket that they never should have let go of in the first place. It was like they were reliving every good thing you two ever shared. But this time there were no doubts allowed. There was only a pure certainty growing strong roots. Inside of them, they can no longer ignore what their heart is screaming for. This was not just an ordinary dream. It was an answer from heaven. It was a message from a higher place telling them that what you two share is not a fantasy. It is not just a passing phase or a memory that will fade. It has a real, solid purpose. And when the universe speaks with this much clarity, it is impossible for them to keep living their life as if nothing happened. Even if they are keeping quiet right now, this person woke up totally changed. Yes, they woke up with a tightness in their chest, but they also woke up with a huge thirst for the truth. What used to be a hidden wish is now turning into a real, burning urge to take action and reach out to you. You really need to know this because the feeling between the two of you never actually went away. It never died. What really happened is that a heart got too hurt and too scared to believe in love again. But after what they saw and felt in their sleep, that thick brick wall is starting to crumble and fall. A bright light broke into their heart, showing them with absolute crystal clarity what is truly worth fighting for in this life. And the answer is you. You are what is worth it. This deep connection refuses to give up, even when the outside world tries to pull the two of you apart. The dream brought them courage. And courage, my dear friend, is usually the one missing puzzle piece that allows true love to finally come to life. When this person opened their eyes this morning, something in the air around them had shifted. There was a deeper ache, a stronger feeling of missing you. But there was also a quiet, beautiful hope that they had not felt in such a long time. That huge wave of emotion was not random. It was the direct result of what they went through in the silent hours of the night. Even if you were not there in a physical body to see it happen, your soul was there. Heaven is constantly working for you. Dreams are one of the deepest and most special ways the universe uses to touch the places that normal words just cannot reach. Your soulmate was visited by that divine presence because something amazing is being prepared for you both. Something that does not just depend on the clock ticking, but depends on the pure truth you both feel for one another. This is exactly why you might be feeling a strange heaviness in your chest today. This is why you might have a sudden urge to cry without knowing why, or a feeling of missing them that just jumped out of nowhere. None of this is in your head. None of this is meaningless. These are real spiritual signs that the two of you are linked together on a level that is way too deep for logic or science to ever explain. A beautiful preparation is happening right now, and it involves some very important decisions that will affect both of you. Heaven chose this exact moment, not yesterday, not next year. Right now, there is a new sense of urgency rising up in their soul. Something has been switched on inside of them, and it was switched on for a reason, to stop them from running away from their true feelings. This amazing dream was just the start. The real, beautiful changes are starting today. You might not have felt the exact second it happened, but something inside of your own body began to vibrate differently from that point forward. When two souls are guided by spirit, neither one walks away the same. While your love's heart was beating quietly in the dark bedroom, a force of pure light wrapped around them with a level of care that only the angels can give. That presence knew exactly where to take them, exactly what to show them, and exactly what needed to be woken up. It was as if a guardian angel took them by the hand and softly whispered, "Come with me. See with your soul what your mind has been too terrified to accept. What they were shown is so much bigger than you could ever guess." It was a sneak peek of what is being set up for your future. You were standing there with a calm peace that touched them deeply. Your eyes spoke thousands of words without you even having to move your lips. It was as if your true, pure self was projected into their sleep to remind them of every single good thing that still lives between you two, and everything that is still waiting to happen in the future. They were not alone in this vision. The presence standing beside them brought a peace that was so huge, so filling, it could only have come from the divine. Was the kind of peace that heals old scars, washes away confusion, and lights up paths that looked like dead ends. That divine company was there because it was deeply needed. Your love had to feel in their very bones that what exists between you two is not over, and more importantly, it has not been forgotten by the universe. Heaven does not send giant signs like this for no reason. When a spiritual guide stays with a soul in the middle of the night, there is a very specific goal. The goal here is the true, unconditional love that ties you to this person. This is a love that stays alive and keeps beating, even through long periods of silence, lots of uncertainty, and miles of physical distance. The energy in that moment was so strong that no words were even needed. Your touch felt completely real. Your smile came as the perfect answer to all the anxious questions this person has been carrying around in their head for months. When they woke up, the feeling did not go away. It stuck to them. It was not just remembering a picture. It was the physical sensation of sharing a deeply intimate moment that time can never wash away. They probably tried to get out of bed, pour their coffee, and act like it was just a normal day. But inside their chest, everything was different. The dream left permanent marks, and those marks have names: love, longing, hope, and direction. What is so wonderful is that this spiritual guide did not force them to do anything. It just gently showed them the truth, touched them with softness. Because sometimes all a human soul needs to truly wake up is a gentle reminder of how deeply it can love and how much it actually wants to live out that love. It was like a blindfold had finally been taken off their eyes. They saw, they felt, they finally understood. Have you ever wondered why you suddenly look up at the sky and ask the universe for a sign, even when you do not fully know what you are looking for? That happens because spiritual cords do not get cut by physical distance. What your soulmate felt last night had a ripple effect that went straight into your heart, too. Something is shifting inside both of you, even if it is happening quietly, behind the scenes. Very few people realize this, but dreams are actually one of the most direct and easy ways for two connected souls to talk to each other. When life gets too messy, when reality keeps putting roadblocks in the way of what the heart wants, the spiritual world uses the silence of the night to do its best work. There is an old, wise saying that when two hearts share the exact same feeling, not even sleep can keep them apart. It truly does not matter what happened in the past between you two. It does not matter what was said or what mistakes were made. When love is real, the connection simply does not die. Time cannot erase it. Human pride cannot hide it for long. True love always finds a way to break through every single barrier. And in our sleep, love is allowed to be exactly what it is: pure, intense, and totally free. There is so much truth hidden in our dreams. In the spiritual world, nothing happens without permission. If your image came back to this person so strongly, if your voice sounded like you were sitting right there on the edge of their bed, it is because a loud calling is being sent from heaven to both of you. Is a calling that does not care about logic. It is built on a connection that was written in the stars on purpose, not by accident. People usually think that dreaming about someone just means you miss them, but that is not always the whole story. Sometimes a dream is the soul shouting out the things that the human body is too scared to say out loud. It is the heart getting exhausted from hiding and using sleep as a way to say, I am still here. I still feel you. I still want us. And when that deep cry echoes from both sides, the universe hears it loud and clear, and it starts moving mountains to make it happen. Dreams that connect soulmates do not fade away by lunchtime like normal dreams, do. They leave a trail of emotions that stick around all day long. Images keep popping up in their mind. Words keep echoing in their ears. Waking up from a dream like that literally feels like waking up from a warm hug that you never wanted to end. And that is exactly what they just went through. A reunion of the soul. A living, breathing reminder of how deeply you are carved into their heart. During this experience, you were not just a flat picture. Your presence gave them a sense of total freedom. For a few hours, their heart was completely free. From the pressures of their job, their friends, their fears, and the loud noise of the world. In that total freedom, they went right back to their safe place. And their safe place is you. This experience was given to them so they would not forget the silent promise that still exists between you two. The promise of a love story that still has so many blank pages waiting to be written. What nobody tells you is that these powerful dreams leave marks on both people. If you have been feeling a little off lately, maybe carrying a strange heaviness, or feeling super emotional, it is because the energetic wave from their dream crashed right into you. The bond between you two is so strong that feelings just flow back and forth easily. It is like you are having a full conversation, without saying a single word or even being in the same zip code. You speak through love. When true love like this exists, heaven does not ignore it. The universe steps in to help. And if you are still listening to these words with an open heart, it is because this message is meant for you. Your soulmate just got an answer to all their secret prayers and hidden feelings. It was heaven saying, I see the two of you, and I still believe in this love. So please do not ignore the little signs in your daily life. Do not brush off these feelings as just a coincidence. What this person experienced was a huge revelation, and you were the star of it. Your soul was pulled into their sleep because a brand new path is being cleared for you both right now. Before this big, intense night happened, there was actually another dream. Smaller, quieter one that happened a little while ago. It was a gentle moment that might have slipped by without much notice, but it was the true starting line for everything that is happening now. You need to know about this first dream because that is when the seed was planted in their heart. In that first dream, there was no loud message or intense bright light. Instead, you just appeared as a peaceful, loving memory. Felt like the world stopped spinning for just 1 minute so their heart could simply look at you again. They did not see a blurry, sad memory. They saw you exactly as you are today. They saw someone who matters, someone who left a beautiful mark on their life. The setting was so calm. There were no arguments, no stress, no demands. Just you, with that look in your eyes that always knew how to make them feel better. In that simple moment, without any logical reason, their heart felt an incredible peace. A kind of peace that only true love can deliver. Waking up from that first dream was very confusing for them. They wondered why you felt so real and why you were suddenly visiting their mind after so much time had passed. But deep down, they already knew. It was because the roots of your love are just too deep to pull out. Over the next few days, something in their eyes shifted. A new restlessness started growing. Even if they looked normal on the outside, the universe was already moving furniture around on the inside. That first dream was like a soft breeze brushing against their face. Waking up. Memories that had been boxed up and put in the attic. Once they felt that breeze, they could no longer pretend the box was not there. The most beautiful part is that you did not have to force anything at all. You just showed up in their sleep, and that was more than enough. You were a reminder of what feels light, what feels true, and what actually has meaning in their life. It was a visit from your soul, and it did not need an invitation because it was born out of pure love. That first dream started a gentle rebuilding process inside of them, taught them how to feel again without being so terrified. It unlocked doors that had been slammed shut by pride or old hurt, and once those doors cracked open, they could not be locked again. From that day on, they started questioning their own feelings. They realized their love for you never died. It was just wearing armor to protect itself. But that heavy armor was no longer strong enough to hold back how much they miss you. Everything in that first dream was perfectly planned by the universe to warm up their heart and make them ready for what was coming next. It was step one, and even if they did not get the full message right away, it left a lasting echo in their thoughts. You probably felt this first step too. Maybe you felt a sudden, strong memory of them or an intense desire to check their social media or look at an old photo. That was not an accident. That was your soul responding to the connection. But then came the second dream, the big one. Last night, everything was taken to a much higher level. It was not just a sweet memory anymore. It was a loud, clear, and sacred calling. The universe pulled back the curtains and let them see everything without any filters. The spiritual presence that walked with them brought such an intense feeling of safety that they knew they were being watched over. They were shown that you are not just a part of their past, but you are their actual destiny. In this higher place of light, it felt like time stopped completely. The universe said to them, "Pay close attention. This love is real and the time to be brave is right now." They looked at you with so much emotion pouring out of them. All the things they kept buried just exploded to the surface. They want to find a way to build a real, solid life with you. In the dream, you smiled and said, "We are so much closer than we think." When they woke up from this second dream, it felt like they had just resurfaced from swimming in the deep end of the ocean. Their chest was full, their heart was racing, and their breathing was soft. This was not a trick of the mind. It was a gift from heaven to help them finally face reality. The divine presence made it crystal clear. The days of loving you in secret are officially over. The universe wants action. It wants surrender. It wants them to make a choice. And because you are tied to them, you are being asked to prepare yourself too. You are not supposed to just sit around passively waiting. You need to understand that all the pieces are being moved into place on the chessboard. Right now, after what they felt last night, your soulmate is changing every single day. This is a spiritual preparation that is guiding them to start making real, physical decisions in their waking life. Heaven is leading them gently, but very firmly. Every action they take from today forward is going to reflect the truth they saw in that dream. The first big change is happening on the inside. They are finally looking in the mirror and being totally honest with themselves. The dream showed them everything they had been trying to ignore. The love that is still beating, the big empty space you left behind, and the huge fear that they might have walked away from the greatest love story they will ever know. They cannot hide from themselves anymore. The truth is out and it wants to be lived. The next change you will see is their desire to get closer to you. It will probably start out very small. Little, subtle gestures that might not seem like a big deal but actually mean the world. Maybe an unexpected text message, simple hello, a like on a photo, or a quiet attempt to just be around you again. They are going to test the water to see if you will still let them in. But do not be fooled by how small the gesture is. Behind it is a massive, sincere desire to reconnect with you without any more walls. They are also feeling a huge urge to clear the air and heal whatever went wrong between you two. This comes from a heart that has been touched by the divine and now desperately wants to do the right thing. The dream showed them their past mistakes, the words they should have said but didn't, and the silly things they did because they were scared. With that clear vision comes a sense of responsibility. They know that if they want to hold your heart again, they have to fix what they broke. They are learning to handle their emotions like a mature adult now. Before, they hid their feelings under insecurity and worried too much about what other people thought. But the dream connected their mind and their heart. The war inside their head is ending. They are ready to take the risk and embrace this love. You will notice these changes in small ways. A shared memory brought up out of nowhere. A comment that shows they have been missing you. A look that holds a little too much care. These are the very first steps. They are being moved by a sacred touch, trying to match their real life to the beautiful dream they had. Slowly but surely, their fear is shrinking and their courage is growing. Their pride is turning into humility. The old habit of running away is being replaced by a strong need to run toward you. They are also going to start letting go of things in their life that block your connection. If there are people, habits, or situations that drain their energy or keep them away from you, they are going to start cutting those cords. The dream showed them what they want, but it also showed them what needs to be thrown in the trash to make room for you. It is a deep cleaning of their soul. Heaven is working on your heart right now, too. You are both being guided toward each other. When they finally reach out, it will not just be a human choice. It will be a direct reflection of heaven's plan. So you need to stay awake and stay alert. What looks like a tiny step is actually the start of a beautiful new journey. You are being prepared to recognize these signs and to welcome them back with a loving, open heart. When two people are being guided by the angels, there is absolutely nothing that can stop them from coming together. You might have felt frustrated with the silence or the waiting. You might have wondered why things had to be so hard or take so long. But there is a perfect, right time for everything. What you are living through right now is part of a grand design. For a long time, there were heavy blocks standing in the way of your love. There were emotional bruises, old baggage, and loud distractions that kept you both from focusing on what truly mattered. But a cycle has finally ended in the spiritual world. The roadblocks have been cleared away so your truth can beat strongly once again. This is a time of extreme clarity. Love is no longer just a feeling of missing someone. It has a real mission now. Your soulmate is being pushed to take action and listen to the crying of their own heart. The timing is happening right now because there is finally enough clear, clean space in both of your lives for this connection to grow without getting choked by outside drama. But heaven needs you to do your part too. When two souls share a love this deep, the universe speaks to both of them. While they are waking up, you are being prepared to receive them. Living this kind of love takes a lot of trust, takes surrender. Heaven wants you to know that when this love comes back together, it is not going to be a repeat of the past. It will be completely new. It will be stronger, more awake, and entirely real. This is why you have been feeling so sensitive. The sudden emotions, the urge to Sit quietly and pray, the random ache in your chest. These are gentle taps on the shoulder from your angels, reminding you that your beautiful future is currently under construction. Your job right now is to release the heavy weight of the past. Let go of the memories that bring you pain. Understand that true love does not always run on our human clock, but it always arrives exactly when our soul is ready for it. And your time is right now. You were never forgotten. Your love was never totally erased from their mind. Grew up in the quiet moments, fed by memories, and now it has been struck by lightning through a powerful spiritual dream. The angels want both of you to drop your heavy armor. Stop being afraid of what happened yesterday and start having hope for what is going to happen tomorrow. This amazing dream was a wide-open door created by the divine so your relationship could finally breathe clean air again. It was given so you both could see that the promise between you is still alive. There are so many wonderful blessings waiting to be handed to you, but you need to be ready to accept them. Being ready means taking excellent care of yourself today. It means protecting your own peace, keeping your faith strong, and keeping your eyes open for the little signs. It means noticing when love starts tiptoeing back into your life, even if it is a little shy at first. Most importantly, it means refusing to close your heart just because you got hurt in the past. The past was your teacher, but your present is your healer. You cannot heal if you refuse to believe in magic again. You are surrounded by silent grace and gentle angelic care. The soul of the person who loves you is moving toward you. They are opening up. They are feeling the pull. Heaven wants your heart to be warm and ready to live this love to the fullest. When a divine revelation like this dream happens, it means the universe is rolling out the red carpet for you. If you and your soulmate choose to listen to this calling, something totally extraordinary is going to happen. When two souls decide to make room for love at the exact same time, life lines up in a way that feels like an actual miracle. This is your chance to reclaim something beautiful that has been weaving itself together in the stars for a very long time. If you both step up and say yes to this feeling, a brand new chapter starts. Immediately, it will be a chapter filled with respect, strength, and real presence. You will both notice that old arguments and walls just do not matter anymore. The things that used to cause pain will become bridges that bring you closer. Guilt and blame will melt away, replaced by the brave choice to try again. Because when love is true, it reinvents itself. It learns its lessons and moves forward holding hands. You are not going backward. You are building something completely new. Heaven has so many beautiful secrets that it only shares when two people walk together. In total honesty, this dream was just the very first key turning in the lock. There are more signs and more wonderful moments coming your way, but you have to be willing to drop the fear that freezes you in place. You have to let faith take the steering wheel. When you align with love, the whole universe stands behind you, supporting every single step you take. If you welcome this calling with a light and happy heart, your own intuition is going to get so sharp. Your inner peace is going to expand, and everything in your daily life will start making so much more sense. The energy of true love has the power to heal the broken pieces inside of you that you thought would never be fixed. And it will do the exact same thing for your soulmate. Love does not just glue a relationship back together. It heals the actual people inside of When you both stop being afraid, the distance means nothing. Talking to each other becomes easy. The spiritual tie gets deeper. Love becomes your shared purpose in life. It brings out the absolute best, most shining parts of who you both are. Heaven knows all of this. That is why it orchestrated this beautiful awakening for both of you at the exact same time. But the next step is up to you. It is a choice. You must choose to listen to your heart and act with bravery. You have been in training for this moment. Your heavy chest and your deep thoughts were not for nothing. If you let this love step into the daylight, the angels will guide every single detail of your reunion. They are holding blessings in their hands, just waiting for the perfect moment to hand them to you. When you respond with trust, your soulmate will feel that brave energy flowing through the invisible cord between you. Your love is vibrating, buzzing with life, just waiting to be lived out loud. You do not have to chase them or try to force destiny to hurry up. You just have to allow the truth of that dream to become your reality. Recognize how valuable this feeling is. Treat it with care and choose it with your whole heart. The path has been cleared. The lights have been turned on. Every step you take will be brighter than the last. Are you ready to truly listen with your soul? If you both hear what this dream was trying to say, get ready for a beautiful ride. The love that felt completely out of reach is about to become the most real, solid thing you have ever touched. Right now, I want you to simply take a breath and relax. Do not overthink any of this. Just let your body feel the truth of what is happening. The human heart does not know how to lie. It beats a little differently when it gets touched by something pure and heavenly. If you feel a warmth or a quickening in your pulse right now, it is because every word of this message was meant directly for your spirit. What your soulmate saw in the night was a sacred confirmation that the string tying you together was never cut. It was just resting. Now it has been activated. This calling is so loud that it traveled through the spiritual realm just to land in your heart today. You are not alone, and you never have been alone in this. This is all part of a silent, beautiful promise made by your souls long before you ever met in this physical life. Your connection is meant to wake up the best parts of each other, heal old sadness, and unlock doors you thought were stuck forever. Life is asking you to look right past your worries and see the beautiful gift heaven is handing you. The dream was a light turning on in a dark house, showing exactly where love still lives and where hope is still breathing. Your soulmate is ready to break free from the chains holding them back. Heaven is not asking you to rush. It is asking you to be present. Keep your heart willing, keep your ears open for the little signs, and keep your faith burning bright even when your logical brain tries to talk you out of it. Miracles happen when we stop asking for a guarantee and just start trusting the feeling in our gut. If you feel like spending some time alone today, or if you feel the urge to just sit quietly and reflect, please do it. That is heaven preparing you for the beautiful days ahead. You are stepping into a time that requires emotional maturity and a willingness to love deeply without panicking. If you ever sit and wonder if all this waiting and hoping is really worth it, let me remind you, right now, this love survived time, it survived silence, and it survived distance. It is still calling your name. That alone proves how rare and precious it is. You have a real chance to live something profound. Pay attention to the coming days. Look for the small gestures. Notice the feelings that bubble up, the memories that pop into your head, and the unexpected ways this person might try to reach out. These things are coming to confirm what you already know. When they take a step toward you, remember that the dream is what paved the road for them. Do not ignore your intuition. It is the most delicate, beautiful tool the angels use to guide us. Move forward with grace, but move with intention. The life you have been dreaming of is so much closer than you think. What felt lost is finding its way back to you. True love always finds its way home. Hold onto this truth with a gentle grip. Your soulmate was forever changed by what they saw in the night. You are hearing this message because heaven does not do anything by accident. You are being prepared for a sacred, wonderful blessing. Be ready. The next few days are totally blank pages waiting to be written on. Do not miss the beautiful little signs heading your way. When they arrive, trust your inner wisdom to recognize them. Always remember, I am right here beside you. I am guiding you, protecting you, sending you divine messages, and walking with you every single day. You are so deeply cherished. May the blessings of heaven pour over you, bringing you endless peace, incredible courage, and perfect clarity for whatever comes your way. You are surrounded by light. You are surrounded by love. Your guardian angel is always watching over you. Amen.